Some of us may be rooting for the offseason to start, but for the Oilers and Panthers, it goes on to a Game 6. Find out how the Oilers extended the series on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, the Stanley Cup Finals, for whatever reason, they keep on keeping on. Whether you were hoping that they would finish tonight with the Panthers on home ice and a chance for Paul Maurice to get his first real cup as a head coach, well, you're going to have to wait. Unfortunately, we are currently in a bit of a holding pattern with this series. The Oilers have, against all odds, again, kind of snatched one from the brink of death and are going on to a Game 6. Now, before we dive into how it happened, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Now, like I said, against all odds, the Oilers have forced a Game 6. You would have thought that with home ice advantage, the Panthers would be able to finish the series off. Not so, say the Oilers. And I think we saw one particularly troubling thing for the Panthers in this game is that for two straight games, Bobrovsky has looked pretty mortal. Now, the first game was definitely worse, make no mistake. Bobrovsky was able to make a few more saves in this one, and I think generally didn't have quite as disastrous an outing as he did in Game 4. But this one, all the same, he looked unsteady. I think he was lacking confidence, and it seemed like the Oilers would test him with off-pace shots, whether it was intentional or deflections. There were some weird shooting angles, and unfortunately for Bobrovsky, he got beat on some weird little chip attempts and stuff that he probably would hate to watch back on his footage. So I think the biggest takeaway from this game is that Connor McDavid is basically writing his own name on the cup. He was on so many of tonight's goals, and it just seemed like his fingerprints have been starting to grow in number in the series. I know that he had a bit of a slow start and that he wasn't scoring much. Now that the dam is starting to finally break, that whole McDrysaddle duo is really, really having its way in the series, and more specifically, McDavid is. Connor has just diced through these defenders at times in ways that, I mean, you just sit there and you just stare in amazement. I think the Corey Perry goal where he cut through like three different defenders who basically had a good triangle, what should have sealed him off didn't really matter. He just sort of danced between them and then around them, exploded past, and fed Perry for an easy tap-in at the far post. And so stuff like that, I think for the Panthers, there's just nothing you can really do. When McDavid wants to McDavid, he's going to McDavid. And I think that is, and really was their strategy for a lot of the playoffs, was to hit the McDavid button 2 to 3 times a game and hope that was enough. When McDavid starts hitting that button himself, though, and does it multiple times, more than 2 to 3 times a game, I mean, you may have a great and really, really balanced roster like the Panthers do, but if Bobrovsky is not able to stem the tide, it's going to be a tough, tough outing. And now that the series is going back to Edmonton, suddenly, that seed of doubt that's been planted in the previous game is starting to flourish. I still think at the end of the day, the Panthers do pull this one out, and, whether they win on the road or at home, I do think that they've given themselves enough of a margin for error, but that margin is rapidly shrinking. And if you told me that the Oilers would come back from a 3-0 deficit to now force a Game 6, I guess it's not like inconceivable, but it was certainly not on my bingo card. I think it was something that a lot of us thought could potentially happen if all of the stars aligned. But those specific stars happen to be McDavid, McDavid, and McDavid. And he seems to be pretty in line with himself. I think he's got, that confidence and that skill that he has demonstrated time and time again, year after year. And maybe this is just a season. I don't know. I feel like if anyone is going to essentially write their own name on that cup, it's probably Connor. The guy is just built different. And I think he has shown it at numerous times throughout the series. And that's not to say that they haven't gotten key contributions from other players. I think Evan Bouchard's impact has really been felt throughout this series. I know that he hasn't always been as impressive as he was earlier in the playoffs, but generally speaking, the Bouch bomb plus his natural puck moving ability and stuff has just been really influential, especially noticeable when you have guys like Cody Ceci really struggling out there. Same with Nurse at times. Both of those guys defensively have sort of had mares. And I think, whether they're scoring or not, it's been a bit of a tough series for both players. And so having Bouchard be your number 1D, I think has been a huge blessing for Edmonton. I think, again, Bouchard's impact throughout the playoffs has really gone unnoticed or underappreciated, but I'm certainly calling attention to it now. I think he's been crazy good for Edmonton over the past, not only the playoff, but, the entire regular season. He's been a monster, which is funny because a while back, people were kind of writing him off and saying that he was looking like a bust. Sometimes you do have to be a little bit more patient. The road to the NHL and really to superstardom isn't always linear. And I know I've certainly had my own expedient judgments on players and prospects, but it feels like Bouch was one of those guys where I was willing to be relatively patient with him because I saw some of the footage that was coming out of junior, and I'm just like, yeah, I just have a certain level of confidence that he's going to sort it out at the NHL level, and boy, has he. Aside from that, I think you've gotten, some decent contributions from guys like Zach Hyman, certainly from Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I think the biggest thing is that they just eat up minutes and create chances and chaos. And again, if they poach a goal or two, great. But if, the main thing here is going to be McDavid, well, as long as you can help McDavid do what McDavid does best, that's the most important thing. Don't inhibit him. Don't hold him back. Just be. Apologies, disconnected my mic. I was just saying that, the biggest thing for those guys is to just not slow McDavid down, because McDavid, when he's at full stride, is almost unstoppable. But I think Edmonton in the past has kind of shown that, the depth players and the surrounding supporting cast have kind of been a problem at times. This time, though, seems like they are all relatively on the same page enough for McDavid to still be able to do McDavid things. And I mean, I hate to describe this series that way, but I feel like that's kind of how it's starting to evolve because, not that Edmonton, again, like I said, isn't getting good contributions from everyone else, but the player who really has had the most outsized impact on the series that's not in goal, it's going to be Connor. And he feels like he will be the guy who ultimately scores the series-winning goal if it does come down to that. But still a long ways to go. Game 6 is definitely a nervy one if you're the Panthers, but I think for the Oilers, all the pressure's on them. This is their chance to extend the series by at least one more game. We're going to find out if they can do it very soon. But for the Panthers, I'm sure that they are just praying and hoping that they can finish out the series and that Paul Maurice walks away with a Stanley Cup title. But again, I'm curious to know who you're all rooting for. I've seen mostly Panthers, I would say. I think a lot of us are kind of in the boat of hoping that Maurice gets his. Otherwise, though, if you're rooting for the Oilers or if you're hoping both teams lose, let me know in the comments below and maybe tell me why. I've seen some interesting articles that they said, Canadian hockey fans aren't tuning in as much. There's a lack of enthusiasm for this Stanley Cup Finals. And sure, I guess that's true. But you know what? It is what it is. It's not the Jets. It's not any of the other big cities. Unfortunate as it may be, at least we do have some sort of Canadian team that's perhaps on the precipice of breaking the curse. Just really wish it could have been almost anyone other than the Oilers. That would have been a lot more preferable. But speaking of, Canadian teams, wanted to chat a little bit more about the Jets and continue our player preview series. We talked about some depth forwards yesterday, guys like Niederreiter, and of course Appleton and Lowry in the past. And so now it's time to take a look more at the fourth line. And there's a couple of guys who I think could be fighting for spots and some players who might be deserving of a promotion. We'll talk about those guys in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. Those of you who have ever bought tickets, whether it's to baseball games or concerts or what have you, you know that it's always going to be fraught with hidden fees, surprise charges, lots of inconveniences, and sometimes when you're buying seats, you're not actually sure where you're sitting, right? You have an idea of the view, but you can only see a seat map. Game Time totally gets it. They've gone through the same process themselves, and they've learned and wanted to change things up and make it easier for you to actually know what you're paying for. That's why they offer in-venue views. They also offer, lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection, among many other things. It's great, right? You want to know that you have a ticket seller out there who's really on your side, and Game Time offers flash deals and zone deals just to tack on the extra fun. Because again, you don't want to waste time spending loads of money on tickets that don't make you happy. Game Time wants you to enjoy yourself and really, treat yourself to something truly special. As an Orioles fan, for me, there's plenty of great opportunities for me to head down to Camden Yards. Maybe some of you are going to head out to Toronto for a Jays game. A little bit far for some of you in Winnipeg, but maybe some of you other listeners are a little bit closer. Be sure to use Game Time, and we also have a special offer for you if you haven't used Game Time before and don't have an account. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Greetings, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just transitioning off of the Cup Finals talk and moving back towards the Jets. Obviously, yesterday's big news, we have a couple of new coaches. Obviously, Dean Chenoweth and Davis Payne are hopefully going to fix the special teams. Davis has actually also been assigned the forwards, while Dean is being tasked with managing the blue liners, which will be interesting, right? Dean has experience with the Canes organization, and he also ran part of the special teams and PK for, Toronto. And it seems like Dean has pretty good results. I'm curious to know about Davis, just because when I looked at his actual PK conversion rates, they weren't great. But when you look at like the underlying metrics for his recent Ottawa Senators power play work, there were signs that, especially I think, what was it, last season or this season, where they were shooting like 20 or converting on like 23% of opportunities. They're creating some pretty decent chances, right? I don't know if it's like a top power play, but it's a lot better than what the Jets have been using. And considering they like to create a lot of net front chaos, maybe a team that's got a player like Gabriel Velarde will actually be a good fit for what Payne wants to do. Curious to know what his work with the forwards is going to be. I can't speak to that side of things as much. I wonder what Arniel is going to ask him to help manage. Maybe it's just training sessions. Maybe there's some tactical and in-game adjustments. I do hope that this doesn't mean that you start seeing conflicts with Arniel's vision versus Davis's vision, although I suspect Arniel will have the last say, and he's probably made it clear that, to some degree, he is going to be the man behind the bench and the man in charge. So will be interesting to see that relationship. You've seen conflicts between coaches on other teams in the past, less so with the Jets, but certainly with other squads. It happens. It's a part of the workplace. And so we're just sort of waiting, and I'd love to see what this team looks like here in a few months as we start getting towards preseason. But like I said, wanted to shout out some fourth-line players who maybe are either fighting for fourth-line spots or maybe even pushing for a little bit more of a prime role. One of those guys that's really interesting to me is David Gustafsson, because as much as I love Gustafsson, I think it's also fair to acknowledge that his road to the NHL has been a little bit rocky. And I think, his performance at this level has been a bit uneven. he is a fun player. He does have some really unique traits compared to some of the other Jets players. For one thing, the guy has a relentless engine. He keeps grinding along the forecheck. He keeps working hard. He keeps back checking aggressively. And for a player of his size, he's pretty fast. Actually, just in general, he's reasonably fast. He's a very strong skater. It seems like he's generally good at resisting pressure when he's carrying the puck. I think the biggest thing for him, though, is that traditionally he hasn't actually turned his possession into much that's been useful, right? That has kind of been a part of his game that's lacking. And I think it's one of the challenges for a lot of folks when they're evaluating players is somebody may be looking like they're doing a lot that's really impactful, but perhaps the underlying metrics start to paint a bit of a different picture, right? Maybe they're struggling with zone entries. Maybe they're not actually sealing off those shooting and passing lanes. Maybe they're just not really effective at any particular thing other than hustling. And that's been the case with a couple of players. I think Gustafsson, though, has started to show more and more that makes me think there's a pretty legit center there. I'd be curious to know what his role is this year because, obviously with the Jets looking around at their roster depth and kind of really realizing that the center depth is not as ideal as I think they would like. Gustafsson has a real chance to fight for a role. I think he's going to be coming up against guys like Kupari, maybe Domestikov if the Jets are still running Vlad there. Gus has also played out wide, and I think he's done a pretty reasonable job. During the postseason, I thought he had a couple of really good shifts, and towards the end of the year, same story. He just looked like a player who was increasingly confident, who was willing to provide that fourth-line spark. That's kind of where I continue to see him. There was a time where I thought maybe he'd be able to occupy a more middle six role, but until we really see him play with perhaps a little bit more skill on his line and in a more offensive-oriented role, I think, for now he's just going to be a really big forechecker who's generally strong on the puck and can force turnovers and be a two-way defensive-y sort of presence. TBD on how effective his overall defensive work is. I think it's still a work in progress. I think that there's still stuff that he's perhaps ironing out and refining, but overall, generally pretty impressed with him. I think, this upcoming season, probably sitting in the more modest offensive range, maybe like a 15-point sort of season. If he does that and is able to contribute some solid two-way play, offering some PKing time and stuff and being a generally effective shutdown presence, I think that would be great. I really am not expecting loads from him just because I feel like, maybe my thought about some of his ceiling was a little bit off base. It feels like he's sort of settled into this role of being just a quality fourth liner. And if that's what you get out of him, hey, you know what? That's pretty darn good. A guy who can eat up those minutes, who can be a PK expert, and who can, slowly make your fourth line really effective and perhaps one that you can trust to have more responsibility. For me, that's great, right? If the fourth line can eat more than 10 minutes a night and actually do it at a good rate and give you solid shifts every other game, I can't really complain about that. We're used to in the past years and seasons having pretty bad fourth lines. That started to change over the last few seasons, and now it feels like the Jets also are developing some decent players who can fit that role and really provide the Jets some nice tertiary depth. If Gustafsson starts to add a little more of a finishing touch to his game, I think that would be really fun. He's definitely the kind of guy that can get into the face-off circles and get into some dangerous areas, but the finishing talent with him kind of has some Adam Lowry vibes. And if you've seen what I'm talking about with Lowry, you get it, right? Maybe not the most effective sniper on the team, but hey, like I said, if he's eating up some hard minutes, offering some defensive and transition stability and able to, chip in a couple of points here and there, I really can't complain. It'd be nice to really see him get a shot to grow into a bigger role with this team. I still think that there's some untapped potential with him, but, TBD on whether or not that's really going to materialize and if the Jets are the team that's going to be able to do that sort of thing. Winnipeg has a lot of players in that role and sort of in his I guess, tier of talent. And I think that's where he maybe runs into a bit of a challenge to get some ice time. The Jets are increasingly deep at the bottom end of the roster. It's just really at the top end where you're still looking for some longer-term solutions. But one of those players that Gus is going to be fighting for a spot with, and certainly does not have the inside track, because this guy, unfortunately for Gus, is producing quite a bit more. That's Morgan Barron. Barron is, I think, a very interesting player for me, a guy that I have really grown to enjoy watching. And we'll chat about what I think he's going to do this season and whether or not he's really deserving of a promotion based on his performance this past season in just a little bit. Greetings, friends, and welcome to tonight's closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about, of course, depth players on the Jets. Winnipeg has increasingly amassed quite a few of them. Unlike previous years, though, the Jets' depth forwards are actually good. This is a team that's actually pretty deep on the back end, or not on the defensive side of things, but on the bottom of the roster, right? Bottom like two lines, the Jets have quite a bit of skill and talent, although, it's not like loads of finishing talent, but it certainly is enough to be noticeable in games where they're driving possession, they're driving transition, they're able to occupy offensive zone time, and they're creating some good chances. Now, there is perhaps an exception to my comment about the finishing, and that's Morgan Barron. Barron this past year scored 11 goals in a fourth line role where he's averaging 3 minutes less than he did last year, and he still scored 11 goals playing like 10 and a half minutes or so this past season. There's really not many players out there in the league who could accomplish that level of offensive production. And look, make no mistake, goals and stuff, it's not everything. But the rate at which Barron was converting and the fact that he was also just generally playing pretty competent hockey overall, I think suggests he deserves a promotion. He looks like a player who might be a better answer to like a Mason Appleton. I would be curious to know if you could flip him maybe to the right side or something and how that would impact his performance. But I feel like Barron has shown enough to where I think there's a little more to his game than a fourth liner. Now, if you keep him on your fourth line, hey, that's great. I think he'll be fantastic there. I think he's done a really good job so far. And if you give him, decent line mates, I think he'll be able to make the most of them. But overall, right, of the guys who have played on the fourth line, not named Nemestikov, I think Barron has really shown among the brightest of this typical rotation. Morgan, I think, again, has a little bit more of an extra gear and layer of skill. He might be the more Andrew Coppy sort of player than, Mason Appleton was. Although, Appleton has still had pretty good defensive impacts. So I don't want to suggest Mason's really fallen off. I just feel like I said on the last episode, there's something lacking with him that maybe a player like Barron could provide. I think Morgan has really shown well. I think he's become a quick fan favorite. He's a tough customer, I'll tell you that. Dude can take and dish out punishment left and right, and he does it pretty quickly. I think we all remember when he busted up his nose or something and immediately came back and was playing like the next shift. The dude is a warrior, and I'll tell you what, in terms of depth players the Jets have picked up, he's become one of my favorite to watch. His game doesn't always translate to a lot of really quality shot metrics and stuff, and I think there are shifts where he occasionally fires a puck blindly or something in a direction that's not really helpful, or sometimes he'll struggle with possession. But overall, I think he's been a pretty fun player, and he's really grown a lot into a guy that, again, I think could move up the lineup a little bit. Maybe not top six, but in like an emergency pitch, I wouldn't mind seeing him maybe alongside Scheifele or something. I think he's got like some power forwardy type skill sets similar to Gustafsson, but he has a little bit more of a natural finishing touch. Barron seems to have a real nose for the net, and it seems like he's been able to take advantage of that. He had, 18 points this past season, and again, playing like 10 minutes, which is really, really impressive. So I feel like Barron has something more to his game. I'd be curious to know what the team assesses his value at, and whether or not they're really thinking about promoting him. I think the one thing the Jets have struggled with over the last few seasons is finishing, right? I mean, they can create some chances down low, but in terms of like consistent 5v5 production, they've really had to lean on a couple of shooters and a really strong defensive structure while not really generating as much offensively as a lot of the top, most elite teams are. And that's where I think, if Barron continues to produce the way that he did this past season in extremely limited minutes, maybe you give him more ice time. Maybe you see what he can do. I'm not suggesting that he's going to be, a top sixer or anything like that, but I mean, we also don't know that he's not. I mean, I would imagine that he's not. I think we all have a pretty good suspicion. But again, if you're looking for internal upgrades and stuff and you're trying to avoid having to spend lots of assets on players who may not be here for long, Barron might be a guy worth investigating for a middle six role. I think he's shown that he's at least better than a fourth liner. And if he starts to really earn his keep as a third liner or perhaps an emergency second liner, again, I feel like that's a pretty dang good outcome. Either way, he was sort of a toss-in in the trade a couple of years ago with the Rangers. And at the time, I was kind of like, you know what? He's got some pretty okay-ish AHL numbers. Maybe he'll start to materialize into something. And after watching his first few games, I'm like, yeah, you know what? Barron has kind of found a niche here, and I think he'll actually fit in quite nicely. And so far, he really hasn't done anything to dissuade that. So I hope he keeps it up. I'm hoping for a nice season. If he was to get to like 20 to 25 points this year, I think that would be sick. Obviously, he will have to see a notable increase in ice time, and I don't know if that's going to happen, but I feel like in terms of the talent and skill, if he was placed in the third line role, I think he could definitely achieve that. I really don't have any questions about that. I think he's shown well enough to really deserve some more consideration for a bigger role with this team. And I have a feeling that Arniel's going to really enjoy using him. I suspect that Dean Chenoweth is also going to get some mileage out of him on the PK. He's a big physical body. He can play center and wing. And he also has, some nice defensive acumen once in a while, especially in more shot blocking and lane blocking stuff. Again, he's not always going to be like an elite, super cerebral sort of player, but I think if you want a guy who does the essentials really well, that's what you're getting with Barron. And the fact that he can chip in like 11 goals playing almost no minutes a night is really fantastic. It just shows that the Jets have found some really cool depth pieces. It's just, it's kind of about arranging them in the most, efficient manner, the way that really gets you the most goals and bang for your buck. I know that's kind of been a challenge for this team, but hopefully Winnipeg starts to piece it together and gives themselves some breathing room. Because, we could be about to see some reduction in talent this upcoming season, and this is where your internal upgrades before you start making trades could really come in handy and give the Jets some tertiary scoring. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But let me know what you're thinking for Barron and Gustafsson. Do you think one of these guys actually gets moved? Do you think they both come back? What role do you foresee them playing this upcoming season? Drop your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with even more off-season coverage, so see you then. And as always, go Jets, go.